This is a tutorial on how to make a scatter plot to represent a correlation. So I'm using some data that represents two variables, grit and persistence. As we looked at in the previous tutorial, grit is represented by a scale that students would complete on their own, and higher scores mean more grit, lower scores mean less grit. Persistence represents the amount of minutes that a student would spend when they're asked to work on a puzzle before they give up. And unknown to the students, the puzzle is actually impossible, so this measures their persistence in a task rather than their actual performance in a task. And in this case, we previously looked at the bivariate correlation and found that there was a significant positive relationship. Now we want to take a look at what that would represent when we see it visually. So when we have two continuous variables like this, the best way to represent them is with a scatter plot. So I'm going to Graphs to Chart Builder, and as we've mentioned before, SPSS reminds you to label your variables as scale or nominal before you get started so that it doesn't come up with any errors. Now I'm in the chart builder. So I have my two variables on the left, and I'm going to go down to the bottom to the gallery to find the scatter plot. So I click on scatter plot, and the first option is the simplest and what we need right now. So I'll just grab that simple scatter. This is a really easy one because one variable goes on the X and one variable goes on the Y. It doesn't really matter which one goes where. But typically, if we have a variable that we see as sort of the outcome we're interested in, or the kind of the dependent variable of sorts, then we tend to put that on the Y-axis. And so in this case, we'll do that. The element properties are not necessary to change in this case, so I'm going to just close them. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. So just as a recap, I went to scatterplot, chose the simple one, put my two variables on the X and Y axes, and then now I'm ready to take a look. Okay. And what I find is that the relationship I saw statistically was a moderate positive relationship. And if you imagine looking at this, it seems as though the trend is very visible, that as the grit scores go up, so do the minutes spent on the impossible task. Sometimes it's easy with a scatter plot to imagine what the lowest and highest numbers represent. So for example, here's somebody on a scale of 1 to 10 who scored very high on the grit index, and that person is almost as in the top echelon of students in terms of their amount of grit. And that student also spent around 17 minutes on this impossible task before they gave up. In contrast, here's a student who's sort of at the low end, and this student represents about the lowest amount of grit within the group, and they also represent one of the lowest number of minutes spent on, just about 1 or 2 minutes spent on the task before they give up. And we see that with some variation, of course, that general trend is visible within this correlation. That's how we would represent this visually, and then statistically we would follow it with the R value, the probability value, and of course the degrees of freedom.